He served this country with honor, paid his dues like every honest American, and followed every neighborhood rule. But when Walter Jenkins had a stroke and spent just 3 weeks in the hospital, his HOA saw an opportunity, and they stole his home right from under him. This is not just a story about greed and power, it's about how easy it is to lose everything when the wrong people run your neighborhood. If you or a loved one live in an HOA-governed community, watch till the end. This could happen to anyone. And when it does, will you know how to fight back? Walter Jenkins had never wanted much. A quiet life, a modest home, and a place where he could sit on the porch with a cup of sweet tea and listen to the wind through the trees. After serving in the Army for nearly 20 years, all he hoped for was peace. When he bought the 2-bedroom house in Maple Ridge Estates, it felt like the reward he never asked for but finally earned. Nestled in a quiet suburb of Georgia, the neighborhood was everything the brochures had promised: quiet, orderly, safe. There were manicured lawns, paved sidewalks, and community barbecues in the summer. It was the kind of place where people waved at each other even if they didn't know your name. Walter paid for that house with a veteran's loan and saved for nearly a decade to afford the down payment. It wasn't a big house, and it wasn't flashy, but it was his. Every inch of it carried a story. The creaky step on the porch where his wife, Dolores, used to sit while watching the sunset. The dent in the kitchen wall from the time his grandson accidentally flung a football indoors. The small garden where he planted marigolds every spring, Dolores's favorite flower. For Walter, it wasn't just a house. It was the sum total of a life lived with honor, hardship, and a quiet kind of dignity. He paid his bills on time. Always. Never missed a mortgage payment, never fell behind on utilities. The HOA fees were steep, but Walter saw them as part of the package. You pay for order. You pay for peace. He'd show up to the quarterly HOA meetings, sit in the back with his hands folded, and vote when it was time. He didn't cause trouble. He didn't ask for special treatment. He just wanted to be left alone to live out the rest of his life in the home he built with love. Neighbors respected him, even if they didn't know much about him. They saw the Army bumper sticker on his old Buick. They saw him walking slowly to the mailbox each morning, wearing his cap, his back a little more hunched each year. Some called him Mr. Jenkins, others just nodded politely. He didn't mind either way. Walter was never the loudest person in the room. He believed that strength didn't need to shout. But time was catching up to him. His knees hurt when he climbed stairs. His hands trembled slightly when he held a spoon. The VA hospital visits became more frequent, though he tried not to let anyone notice. He lived alone now. Dolores had passed 6 years ago, and their children had moved out of state long ago. His closest relative was his niece, Rochelle, who visited once a month and called every Sunday. Walter was still proud. He didn't like asking for help, didn't want to be a burden. He did what he could, and when he couldn't, he waited until he felt strong enough. His home remained immaculate. The front lawn was trimmed once a week, rain or shine. The mailbox was painted fresh each spring. He raked leaves even when no one else on the block bothered. He knew the HOA rules by heart. The grass must be no more than 3 inches high, no chipped paint on mailboxes, no garbage cans visible from the street, no flags unless pre-approved. Walter followed every rule. Not because he feared the fines, but because he believed in order. He believed in fairness. If everyone did their part, no one would have to worry. For years, that belief held. There were small frustrations, letters about minor infractions, new rules about parking and garden decorations, but Walter complied. Even when it didn't make sense, he complied. He had fought wars. He had known real danger. An annoying letter from the HOA wasn't going to shake him. So when the first signs of trouble began, new faces on the HOA board, more aggressive tone in newsletters, strange inspections without notice, Walter didn't think much of it. He thought maybe they were just trying to keep things tight. After all, neighborhoods change. People come and go. He never imagined that change would turn so dark, so fast. Walter had always believed that if you did the right thing, life would reward you with peace. He had no enemies. He had nothing to hide. So when he felt the sudden weakness in his left arm one morning, followed by a spinning room and a sharp pain in his chest, he thought of everything he still needed to do that day. Mow the lawn. Trim the hedges. Pay the water bill. He never thought that leaving his home that morning in an ambulance would be the last time he'd see it as his own. What happened in the 3 weeks that followed would shatter every belief Walter Jenkins had about fairness, about neighbors, and about what it means to truly own something in America. Walter Jenkins had always been stubborn about his health. He didn't like hospitals, didn't trust pills, and brushed off every ache and twinge as just old age. But that morning, as he reached for the coffee pot with trembling fingers and the left side of his body gave way beneath him, even Walter knew something was wrong. His vision blurred, his legs folded like paper, and the world tilted violently. When the ambulance arrived, the paramedics said it was a mild stroke, not life-threatening, but serious. He needed rest, monitoring, and no stress for at least 3 weeks. The doctors admitted him to a VA hospital in Atlanta. His niece Rochelle, panicked and tearful, drove in from Macon to be by his side. She wanted to stay longer, but her job as a nurse and her 2 boys at home made it hard to be away. Walter assured her again and again that he would be fine. "Just check on the house once or twice if you can," he told her, trying to sound strong. But Rochelle worked 12-hour shifts, and traffic between cities was unpredictable. Days passed. Then weeks. Neither of them knew that each passing day brought not just medical recovery but a quiet storm building back home. Maple Ridge Estates prided itself on appearances. Lawns trimmed like golf courses, fences painted the same shade of white, and porches free of clutter. It was the kind of neighborhood where deviations weren't overlooked, they were documented. And in Walter's absence, nature did what it always does. Grass grew, weeds sprouted, and a few yellow leaves from the oak tree settled near the steps. To anyone else, it would have looked like a house whose owner had simply gone on vacation or fallen behind on yard work. But to the wrong eyes, it looked like opportunity. The new HOA president, Cheryl Dawson, had recently taken office after years of quietly lobbying for stricter enforcement and less tolerance. She called it beautification. Others whispered it was something else, something colder, more calculating. Cheryl had a reputation for sending letters before introducing herself. She didn't knock on doors. She sent fines. Her favorite phrase was, "We have standards." It didn't take long for Walter's house to land on her radar. A report was filed, grass exceeds height limit. Porch debris present. A violation notice was printed and dropped in his mailbox. Cheryl never checked to see why Walter hadn't responded. She didn't ask neighbors if he was away for health reasons. She simply escalated the violation, turning a $75 citation into daily fines. With each passing day, the total rose. Within 10 days, the fines passed $600. By the time Walter reached day 15 in the hospital, Cheryl had already contacted the HOA's legal contractor. Walter, of course, knew none of this. In the sterile white walls of the hospital, he spent his days with physical therapists, trying to regain control of his left arm. He practiced walking down short hallways, holding onto a rail. He spoke slowly, his words slurred from the stroke, but his spirit remained sharp. All he thought about was going home. He asked Rochelle to bring him his VA checkbook so he could pay the utility bill and order new grass seed for spring. His focus was still on the little things, keeping up the home, staying ahead of the weather, never letting things fall apart. He had no idea they already had. By week 3, the HOA's lien had been filed at the county office. Under a little-known provision in the Maple Ridge HOA bylaws, repeated violations left unaddressed for more than 14 days could trigger a lien and foreclosure process, all without ever going to court. Cheryl didn't need a judge. She didn't need a jury. Just a vote from the HOA board, which she had stacked with friends and old real estate contacts. They had the power to act, and they did. The home was declared abandoned due to neglect. The files were pushed through in record time. Notices, if sent at all, were addressed to Walter's home, where no one was present to collect them. No phone call was made. No email. No welfare check. No effort to determine the owner's condition. Just a series of boxes checked, a signature stamped, and a file handed off to the HOA's preferred buyer, a local house flipper who had purchased 2 other properties in the community under suspiciously similar circumstances. Walter's name was quietly removed from the records. A new deed was filed. Within a matter of days, the home that had taken Walter 18 years to pay off was no longer legally his. Back in the hospital, Walter had no idea that as he struggled to stand up without assistance, as he fought to hold a fork without shaking, his home was being prepped for resale. New locks were scheduled to be installed. His belongings were still inside, but that wouldn't matter. In the eyes of the HOA, the house was no longer a home. It was a product. And it had been claimed. What Walter didn't know was that when he finally returned to Maple Ridge Estates, it would not be to healing or peace, it would be to heartbreak, outrage, and a fight for justice he never asked for. Walter Jenkins was discharged on a quiet Thursday morning. He moved slower now, his left side still weak, but he was determined. Rochelle helped him into the car, his eyes lit with a quiet resolve as he whispered, "I just want to go home." He imagined the feel of his favorite chair, the quiet hum of the ceiling fan, the comforting smell of old books and polished wood. He had spent weeks in a sterile room surrounded by machines. Home meant everything now, peace, safety, dignity. But peace was the one thing waiting for him least. When they pulled up to Maple Ridge Estates, Walter noticed something was wrong. The grass had been cut, but not by his old mower. The marigolds were gone. The American flag he'd kept neatly folded on the porch railing was missing. And then he saw the lock. A shiny, digital padlock on his front door. Foreign. Unfamiliar. Unauthorized. Rochelle tried the key anyway, but it didn't fit. A paper was taped to the glass, private property. Trespassers will be prosecuted. Contact HOA management for access. The word stung like a slap. Private property. Trespassers. On the home he had paid for in full. Rochelle called the HOA office immediately. After nearly 30 minutes on hold, someone finally answered and told her the house had been foreclosed due to prolonged neglect and non-payment of assessed fines. Walter sat quietly in the passenger seat, eyes fixed on the door he couldn't walk through. His cane trembled in his grip. He wasn't just locked out, he had been erased. The HOA's president, Cheryl Dawson, claimed they had followed the proper procedure. The board had sent notices, assessed fines, and posted warnings. When no payment or response came, they executed a lien and sold the property to a private investment firm. According to her, everything was by the book. But the book had been written by people like Cheryl, people who understood how to hide cruelty behind policy. Digging deeper, Rochelle found the web. The real estate firm that purchased Walter's home was owned by Cheryl's brother-in-law. The landscaping company that filed the original complaint about Walter's lawn had been newly contracted by Cheryl after she took office. The law firm used to process the foreclosure paperwork was on retainer with the HOA, a firm known for rapidly processing high volumes of default filings, especially in predominantly black communities. The entire system had been designed to cycle homeowners out, then flip the homes for profit. Walter's case wasn't the first. A young single mother down the street had lost her house after being hospitalized during pregnancy. An elderly woman with Alzheimer's had her home seized while she stayed with her daughter for 6 months. Each time, the pattern was the same: silence, fines, foreclosure, and resale. Each time, the story was buried under paperwork. Maple Ridge wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a pipeline. A machine built to strip homes from those who couldn't fight back. The rules weren't written for safety or community. They were written for control. The HOA had become a shadow government with unchecked power, and Cheryl sat at the top like a queen guarding her throne. Walter filed a complaint with the county housing authority, but it went nowhere. HOAs were protected under state law, and unless someone could prove malicious intent or fraud, there was little legal ground to stand on. Rochelle contacted local news stations. Most never returned the call. One producer said the story sounded too local to get airtime. Even the local paper, once known for covering neighborhood injustices, declined to investigate. It seemed no one wanted to challenge the HOA machine. But Walter refused to give up. He didn't have much strength left in his body, but what he had, he poured into resistance. With Rochelle's help, he began collecting documents, interviewing other victims, and building a paper trail of everything that had been done. Each fine, each letter, each shady sale. Piece by piece, a pattern emerged, one that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or error. He wasn't just fighting for his house now. He was fighting for every quiet homeowner who had been pushed out, every voice ignored, every person who thought they were safe just because they followed the rules. Walter had followed every rule, and they still came for him. That meant no one was safe. The HOA hadn't just taken his home. They had awakened a warrior. What they didn't realize, what they'd underestimated, was that beneath Walter's soft voice and gentle manner was the soul of a soldier. He had survived war. He had survived loss. He had survived a stroke. And now, he was coming for justice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been robbed in the name of order. The war for Maple Ridge had begun. Word of what happened to Walter Jenkins began to spread. Not through headlines or television specials, but through whispered phone calls, church prayer groups, and quiet conversations over fences. His neighbors, many of whom had admired his quiet strength and friendly wave over the years, were shocked to learn that the man who had lived in their community for nearly 2 decades had been locked out of his own home while recovering from a stroke. For many, it was the final proof of what they had feared for a long time. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules, it was exploiting them. An elderly widow 2 streets over remembered getting a warning for leaving her trash bin out 6 hours past pickup time. A single mother on Elmwood Drive recalled being fined for her daughter's plastic tricycle left on the porch. A young Latino couple had once received a violation for parking their family SUV, which had a small dent, in their own driveway. They had all felt the same pressure: conform or be crushed. But until Walter's story surfaced, they hadn't fully grasped how far it could go. The whispers turned into questions. And the questions turned into meetings. Informal gatherings began to form in living rooms, backyard sheds, and Zoom calls. Residents compared letters, fines, violation notices. They started noticing patterns: certain families targeted more than others, fines escalating rapidly with no explanation, appeals denied without due process. People began looking at each other differently. Not with suspicion, but with solidarity. Rochelle took Walter's case files and created a simple flyer outlining the timeline: stroke, hospitalization, unanswered fines, lien, foreclosure. She added names of the real estate company, the HOA president, and the title company involved. The flyer didn't include accusations, just facts. But facts were enough. The flyer circulated fast. Within days, copies appeared taped to mailboxes, slid under doors, and posted on community bulletin boards. It traveled further than Rochelle expected, reaching not just Maple Ridge residents but nearby neighborhoods that were also under HOA management. A retired teacher named Mrs. Temple offered her garage for the first in-person meeting. Over 40 residents showed up. Black, white, Latino, Asian, families from all walks of life, bound by the same fear that if it could happen to Walter, it could happen to any of them. Some shared their own stories. One man had paid over $3,000 in fines for minor lawn issues while his appeal was ignored. A woman confessed she had nearly lost her home after taking unpaid leave to care for her cancer-stricken mother. In every story, the same elements appeared: silence, speed, and cold bureaucracy. From these meetings came action. A group of residents formed a coalition, calling themselves Neighbors for Justice. Their goal wasn't to dismantle the HOA, but to expose its abuse and reclaim power for the homeowners. They began gathering official documents, requesting HOA meeting minutes, and combing through property records. Some volunteers had legal experience. Others had connections in local media. One neighbor even had a cousin who worked in the office of a sympathetic city council member. Neighbors for Justice launched a website detailing stories of HOA overreach and unfair treatment. They created an online petition demanding a full audit of Maple Ridge HOA's foreclosure and lien processes. Within a week, it had 3,000 signatures, including many from outside the community. People were beginning to see Maple Ridge as a symbol, not just of one man's loss, but of a broader national problem. The media, which had once turned a blind eye, now began to take notice. A local news reporter attended one of the coalition meetings and published an article titled, "The HOA That Took a Veteran's Home." The piece gained traction, shared thousands of times on social media. Soon, regional and national outlets were calling Rochelle, asking for interviews. Walter's story had become a rallying cry, not just for victims of HOA abuse, but for anyone who'd ever been bullied by bureaucracy. The pressure forced the county commissioner to issue a public statement calling for increased oversight of homeowner associations and their use of foreclosure powers. It wasn't much, but it was a start. More importantly, it opened the door to possible legislation that could limit HOA powers and require third-party mediation before any foreclosure could proceed. Inside Maple Ridge, Cheryl Dawson's hold on power began to crack. Longtime board members started distancing themselves. 2 resigned quietly. A recall petition began circulating. Residents who had once voted passively or ignored HOA politics entirely were now reading every bylaw, attending every meeting, and demanding transparency. What began with silence was turning into a movement. And at the heart of it was a man who had once been overlooked, not because he was unimportant, but because he was quiet, consistent, and assumed decency would be returned in kind. Walter's suffering had pulled the blindfold off an entire neighborhood. The community was no longer afraid. They had seen what silence cost. Now, they were ready to speak. The more the community spoke up, the more aggressive the HOA became. Cheryl Dawson, facing growing opposition and public pressure, doubled down on the one tool she knew best: fear. Within days of the recall petition circulating, new violation letters began appearing on doorsteps. Fines were issued for ridiculous infractions: a garden hose left uncoiled, a Halloween wreath displayed past the season, a mailbox that appeared faded under sunlight. It was clear retaliation, precise and petty. Residents who had attended Neighbors for Justice meetings were hit hardest. A retired couple suddenly found their driveway labeled non-compliant for having a small crack in the concrete. A single father was cited for having toys visible in his backyard. Rochelle received a notice threatening legal action for organizing unlawful assemblies. The message was unmistakable: speak out, and you'll pay. Cheryl wasn't working alone. She had allies still embedded on the board, a legal team funded through HOA dues, and a property management firm eager to profit from the rising tide of foreclosures. Every violation came with escalating fines. Every fine came with warnings. And every warning reminded homeowners that non-compliance could result in liens and eventual seizure of property. The same playbook used against Walter was being weaponized against others. The HOA didn't need to be fair, it just needed to be relentless. But the people had changed. They no longer believed they were alone. With each letter, the coalition grew tighter. They began documenting every notice, every fine, every interaction. Residents took photographs, recorded conversations, and posted their experiences online. The Neighbors for Justice website became a hub for legal resources, community organizing, and exposing corruption. They started a GoFundMe to help cover legal fees for homeowners threatened with foreclosure. Within 2 weeks, it raised over $40,000. Attorneys took notice. A civil rights lawyer from Atlanta offered pro bono assistance, citing a disturbing pattern of racial and economic targeting. A nonprofit housing advocacy group filed an injunction to freeze pending foreclosures until an independent audit could be conducted. What had started as one man's struggle to return home had now become a legal war, with eyes from across the state watching. Despite growing resistance, Cheryl refused to back down. She held an emergency HOA meeting, closed to the public, where she pushed through a motion to increase penalties for disruptive behavior and grant the board broader authority to suspend homeowners' privileges. It passed narrowly, thanks to proxy votes from absentee landlords who rarely saw what happened on the ground. It was a last-ditch effort to hold control, but it only stoked more outrage. Homeowners began demanding access to financial records. They wanted to know where their dues had gone, who had profited from legal fees, and why so many contracts, landscaping, security, maintenance, had gone to companies with personal ties to Cheryl and her allies. Under state law, the HOA was required to provide transparency. Cheryl stalled, citing ongoing investigations and privacy concerns. But her excuses were no longer enough. The county auditor's office received over 150 formal complaints in a single week. Pressure from the media and legal groups pushed the state attorney general to announce a preliminary investigation. Cheryl's name, once unknown outside her subdivision, began appearing in local editorials and social media threads as the symbol of unchecked HOA abuse. The residents of Maple Ridge didn't wait for the system to catch up. They organized a neighborhood canvass, going door to door to share resources and collect signatures for a full board recall. More than 2/3 of homeowners signed. They held a public forum at the community center, streamed live on social media, where victims shared their stories. Walter appeared in a wheelchair, weak but determined, and received a standing ovation. When he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, he said only 5 words, "This isn't just my fight." That moment marked a turning point. The retaliation wasn't working. It had only revealed the HOA's desperation. What Cheryl didn't understand was that fear loses power once it's exposed. The illusion of control she had maintained for years had cracked, and through that crack, truth and unity had rushed in. Neighbors who had never spoken before now supported one another. They mowed each other's lawns to avoid citations. They created a shared spreadsheet to track fines. They called media contacts, updated legal teams, and organized safe spaces for those facing retaliation. The tactics that once worked in silence now failed in the spotlight. The HOA had turned on its own community, hoping to isolate the loudest voices. Instead, it awakened an army. For every letter sent in intimidation, 100 were mailed in protest. For every new violation issued, another story surfaced online. The resistance was no longer a reaction. It had become a movement with a moral compass, legal backbone, and a public voice too strong to ignore. The residents of Maple Ridge no longer feared the rules, because they had learned how the rules could be rewritten. The day the state launched a formal investigation into Maple Ridge's HOA operations, a wave of silence swept across Cheryl Dawson's inner circle. The audit request, supported by mounting evidence and legal affidavits, had passed through the Attorney General's office with surprising speed. What once felt like an impossible goal, holding a powerful HOA president accountable, now had the full force of the law behind it. Inspectors arrived with subpoenas. Board members who once stood firm by Cheryl suddenly became unavailable, resigning without comment or claiming they had no knowledge of financial mismanagement. Documents began to surface. Internal emails revealed that fines were often issued without proper documentation or resident notification. Several contractors hired by the HOA had direct connections to Cheryl's family and were paid inflated fees for minimal work. A landscaping company managed by Cheryl's nephew had received over $150,000 in 2 years. A legal firm responsible for the HOA's foreclosure filings had taken a hefty commission on every lien placed, often charging legal fees far above the industry average. At the heart of it all was the foreclosure pipeline. Maple Ridge's HOA had foreclosed on 8 homes in the past 4 years. Each case followed a similar pattern: escalating fines, ignored appeals, sudden liens, rushed sales. In several instances, the HOA had failed to provide proper notice, bypassing mediation entirely. One home had been sold for less than half its market value to a shell company that later resold it for profit, traced back to an associate of the HOA's treasurer. As these details emerged, the public outrage reached a boiling point. News stations ran primetime specials. National media began connecting the dots to other HOAs accused of similar abuses. Walter Jenkins' name became a rallying symbol for housing justice reform, his case cited in legal seminars and advocacy campaigns across the country. His photograph, a quiet man in a wheelchair in front of the house he nearly lost, appeared in newspapers and on Capitol Hill during committee hearings on HOA regulation. The pressure worked. A court order froze the HOA's ability to issue new fines or initiate foreclosures. Cheryl Dawson was removed from her position pending the outcome of the audit. Her personal finances were placed under review, and her assets, once hidden behind trusts and business entities, were dragged into the light. It was no longer about petty rules or neighborhood politics. It had become a case of systemic abuse and financial fraud. Neighbors for Justice held their first open election to replace the HOA board. For the first time in years, residents had a say in who would represent them. Rochelle was elected president, winning by a landslide. Other members of the coalition filled the remaining seats. Their first act in office was to suspend all outstanding fines, establish an independent oversight committee, and hire a new management company with no ties to the previous regime. But reckoning wasn't only about punishment, it was about repair. The board filed a motion to restore ownership of foreclosed homes to the original residents where possible. In Walter's case, the title was officially transferred back to his name, and the lien was erased. The board offered to cover all legal fees and back mortgage payments that had resulted from the wrongful foreclosure. Walter, humbled but firm, declined full restitution until others in similar situations were made whole. He insisted on fairness for all, not just for himself. A community reparations fund was established using recovered HOA assets and settlements. The fund helped residents who had been fined into debt, assisted those with home repairs previously denied approval, and provided legal aid to others still fighting HOA abuses in different neighborhoods. Maple Ridge, once a symbol of corruption and fear, became a model for reform. Lawmakers took notice and began drafting legislation to prevent HOAs from acting as unregulated fiefdoms. Proposed bills included mandatory oversight, transparent financial reporting, limits on fine accumulation, and requirements for third-party arbitration before any foreclosure. The change didn't happen overnight. Trust had to be rebuilt. Pain had to be acknowledged. And wounds, both personal and collective, had to be tended to with patience. But slowly, the fear began to fade. Neighbors started walking more freely, speaking more openly, and waving to each other not just in passing, but with renewed purpose. A lawn left unmowed was met with an offer of help, not a threat of penalty. The community remembered what it meant to be human before it remembered what it meant to be compliant. The reckoning of Maple Ridge did not just bring justice, it restored dignity. And in that dignity, residents found something more powerful than any rulebook, a shared future that they would shape together, on their terms, with their voices, and with a promise never to let silence cost them their homes again. In the months following the upheaval, the name Maple Ridge became more than just a neighborhood. It became a case study, a movement, a warning. What had begun as quiet injustice, hidden behind community newsletters and polite phrases like violation notice and property standards, was now openly discussed in city council meetings, law schools, and national newsrooms. And through it all, the residents of Maple Ridge refused to let their story be rewritten by those who had once silenced them. The new board, driven by transparency and accountability, took deliberate steps to dismantle the system that had nearly destroyed their community. Every policy was reviewed, rewritten, and reproved through open forums where every voice mattered. Monthly meetings were live-streamed. Budgets were broken down line by line. Contracts were open for public bidding. No more backroom deals. No more shadow fines. The homeowners were no longer ruled, they were represented. Education became a core part of the reform. Workshops were held on homeowners' rights. Legal clinics helped residents understand what HOAs could and could not do under state law. Young families, immigrants, and seniors who had once been too afraid to question authority were now empowered to challenge it. Students from nearby colleges volunteered to translate documents, build community websites, and help elderly residents file paperwork. The sense of fear that had once hung over Maple Ridge like a storm cloud was replaced by something unfamiliar, hope. It didn't mean the trauma disappeared. For many, it never would. Walter Jenkins still had medical bills. Some residents never returned, choosing instead to sell and move on. The memories of letters taped to doors, threats of foreclosure, and sleepless nights couldn't be erased with policy changes. But those memories were now told with pride, not shame. They were badges of survival in a fight that had seemed impossible. Local officials began to pay attention. A state senator introduced the Jenkins Act, a proposed bill named after Walter, which would require all HOAs to disclose foreclosure procedures publicly and ban any action taken without third-party review. It also proposed protections for elderly and disabled homeowners, ensuring that accommodations could not be used against them in disciplinary actions. The bill passed through the committee with bipartisan support. Walter's name, once dismissed by Cheryl's HOA as insignificant, now sat at the heart of legal reform that could impact millions of homeowners nationwide. The legacy of Maple Ridge extended beyond laws and meetings. It inspired other neighborhoods to question their own leadership. Across the state, residents began organizing, investigating their boards, and connecting with one another through online platforms and legal networks. The phrase, "never again," became a quiet rallying cry, written in chalk on sidewalks, etched into community bulletin boards, printed on t-shirts at local rallies. The pain of Maple Ridge wasn't just a warning. It was a blueprint for resistance and repair. What made the story endure was not just the corruption that had taken place, but the way ordinary people chose to confront it. They weren't lawyers or politicians. They were nurses, teachers, janitors, veterans, and parents. People who had been taught to follow the rules but learned the hard way that blind obedience is not the same as justice. They stood up not because they wanted power, but because they refused to live in fear one day longer. Their fight wasn't just for homes. It was for dignity. For the right to plant a tree without punishment. To hang lights in the window without fear. To raise their children on a street where justice wasn't reserved for the wealthy or connected. And in that fight, they learned what it meant to be a real community, not one governed by intimidation, but by mutual respect. Walter never sought attention. Even as his name was honored and his story cited across the country, he remained quiet, humble. In interviews, he often redirected praise to his neighbors. To Rochelle. To the teenagers who canvassed doors. To the elderly woman who refused to sell. He once said, "I just wanted to come home. I didn't know coming home meant changing everything." And that's what they did. They changed everything. The sidewalks where letters had once blown in the wind were now places where neighbors gathered. The homes that had once felt like prisons were now symbols of pride. New families moved in, not warned, but welcomed. And the sign at the entrance of Maple Ridge, once a bland declaration of exclusivity, now bore a new inscription on a bronze plaque beneath it. "This is our home. We built it together. We protect it together. And we will never be silent again." The story of Maple Ridge ended not with revenge, but with resolve. Never again would neighbors be afraid to speak. Never again would silence be mistaken for peace. Never again would a home be taken in the name of control. And never again would a community forget that power belongs to the people, not to the ones who write the rules, but to the ones brave enough to rewrite them. Maple Ridge was never just a neighborhood, it was a battleground for dignity. What happened there could happen anywhere. Behind the fences and manicured lawns, behind polite letters and quiet threats, a system had grown that punished the powerless and protected the privileged. But the people pushed back. Not with violence. Not with vengeance. But with truth, courage, and unity. This story isn't just about one community's fight against corruption. It's a reminder that silence allows injustice to thrive. That every small rule can become a weapon. That fear can turn neighbors into strangers. And that it only takes a few brave voices to change everything. If you live in an HOA-controlled neighborhood, ask questions. Read the rules. Attend the meetings. Help your neighbors understand their rights. Don't wait for the next family to lose their home before you act. Because no one should be fined into poverty. No one should be threatened out of their home. And no one, no matter their age, income, or background, should be told they don't belong. What happened in Maple Ridge isn't just a warning. It's a call. Stand up. Speak out. Protect your neighbors. Because a community isn't built on rules, it's built on people. Never again.